At 0855, Nagumo finally decided to apprise Admiral Yamamoto of the situation he had been grappling with for the last hour and a half, signalling, "Enemy composed of 1 carrier, 5 cruisers, and 5 destroyers sighted at 800 in positions bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. We are heading for it." By any measure, this was a very sparse communiqué regarding the current situation. It made no mention of what Kid Butai had been doing since the sighting, nor of Amari's recent report hinting at additional enemy vessels. In fact, though Nagumo could not know it, Yamamoto was already well aware of the presence of the enemy, having intercepted a number of the previous transmissions between Tony No. 4 and Kid Butai. Incredibly, the unexpected presence of the American carrier apparently did not disturb Yamamoto and his staff in the slightest. Captain Kuroshima asked if they should order Nagumo to attack the Americans, but almost immediately vacillated by reminding the commander-in-chief that Nagumo was to have kept half of his aircraft in reserve for just such a contingency. Yamamoto let the matter drop. His leadership at this moment was nothing short of nonchalant, a far cry from the heavy-handed rigidity he had shown a mere 2 months earlier. At the same time Nagumo was sending his situation report, cruiser Chikuma was recovering 2 of her search planes. It was standard operating procedure for the planes to land in the wake of their mothership, so as to receive the benefit of the relatively calm water there. As soon as they set down, the cruiser would execute a 90-degree turn, usually through the wind, so as to create an area of stiller water on the lee side of her hull. The plane would then taxi up to the ship to be winched on board by the ship's crane. At 0855, Chikuma was dead in the water and recovering her aircraft. This made her vulnerable to submarine attack, but there was no other practical way of retrieving her planes. By 0902, having recovered a Type 95 and a Type 0, she began working herself back up to rejoin the formation. Submarine attack was a very real possibility, as Kid Butai's old nemesis, Nautilus, was still in the neighbourhood. With Kid Butai's carriers more or less holding their respective courses during landing operations, Lieutenant Commander Brockman picked this inopportune moment to put in a third appearance. Poking his periscope up at 0846, he saw that his original group of ships and the target battleship were all well out of range except for the Jintsu-type cruiser, whose echo ranging was still quite accurate. Nautilus headed back down for a bit. Then at 0900, Brockman raised scope again and was thrilled to sight a Soryu-class carrier off his starboard bow, heading east at 25 knots, some 16,000 yards distant. She was apparently undamaged, but was firing her AA guns at something and changing course continuously. Brockman was on a converging course, but once again Nagara ruined his approach. Brockman noted that, while making this observation of the carrier, the Jintsu-type cruiser began to close again at high speed. Admiral Kimura was handling his flagship with dash and aggressiveness. This time Brockman resolved to go after the pesky cruiser instead of firing a single torpedo at the zigzagging target at 09-2. The range was close, just 2,600 yards, but Nagara changed course, the torpedo missed, and Brockman had no choice but to go deep as quickly as possible. He rigged for depth charging and didn't have long to wait, as the Japanese shortly dropped a brace of 6 of them on his boat, followed by another 8 over the next 20 minutes. Interestingly, if Nagara noticed the fish being fired at her, she did not report it. One of her consorts, though, the destroyer Arashi, noted receiving the attack, indicating that she must have been in proximity to Nagara at the time. In any case, either on his own initiative or perhaps as ordered by Nagara, Sea Doctor Watanabe Yasamusa of Arashi decided to remain behind and pin Nautilus down. The Japanese probably didn't know that thus far they had had 3 visits from the same submarine, but the fact remained that there had been too many of them poking their noses out this morning. It was time to let Kid Butai get far enough ahead of this one that it wouldn't be a problem anymore. Throughout these happenings, the carriers were still bringing down strike aircraft. the landing process had not proceeded in a uniform fashion across the fleet. Kaga recovered all of her aircraft by 0850. Hiryu had apparently not yet even begun recovering hers by that time, for reasons unknown. Akagi completed recovery at 0859, some 22 minutes after she began. The carriers of Cardiff II both completed their landings by 0910. Immediately thereafter, Akagi recovered a lone cap fighter, and Kaga brought down 5 more of her own Zeros from her third watch. Once landing operations were complete, the deck crews lost no time moving the strike aircraft below to the hangars. Many of the flight crews had already made their way to their ready rooms for debriefing. This would be the first chance that the ship's officers had to get a detailed picture of what had occurred over Midway more than 2 hours earlier. Yet the normal debriefings apparently did not take place immediately. Everyone was too busy with preparations for the coming strike. This was unfortunate, because some valuable information could have been learned from the returning airmen, particularly regarding the defensive firepower of the Americans. For one thing, it would have helped explain why there were so many faces missing in the ready rooms of Cardiff II. The first part of the morning mission had gone well, with Tomonaga leading his force southward into ever-improving weather conditions. Yet, despite radio silence on their part, the Japanese had found Midway alerted to their coming when they sighted the island at 0615, some 40 miles distant. Tomonaga hadn't known, of course, that Kid Butai had been detected by an American PBY less than an hour after his force's departure. All he knew was that all of the enemy's aircraft had been airborne. By 0617, the Japanese formation had closed up in preparation for attacking, just in time to have numerous undetected American fighters make diving runs on their formation at 0621. Hiryu had lost 3 Kanko in the first pass before Suganami's fighters had been able to react. 2 were from the tail end of the first Chutai. The third was the leader of Hiryu's second Chutai, Lieutenant Kikuchi Rokuro. Kikuchi's plane was so badly hit that he was forced to ditch near Kure Island, though he and his crew survived the crash. PO-1C Maruyama Taisuke, commander of a plane in the second Chutai, had looked across to the first Chutai in horror, as PO-2C Miyauchi Masaji's Kanko was hit in the fuel tank by one of the Wildcats. Mortally wounded, the torpedo bomber began blazing up. To Maruyama, Miyauchi's plane seemed so close he could almost reach out to it. He could see the struggling faces in the cockpit as Miyauchi bravely held his formation. But as Maruyama watched, the flames consumed the cockpit, and the Kanko nosed over for the sea below. Another first Chutai Kanko joined Miyauchi in a similar death dive, that of PO-1C Toba Shigenobu. On his opposite side, Maruyama could see Hikotaicho Tomonaga's Type 97 blowing gasoline vapor out of a hole in its wing. The commander's plane briefly caught fire, but the flames later died out. Further off, a Type 97 from Soryu also fell to the enemy fighters. After the Wildcats had expended their initial attacks, though, Suganami's men had largely had their way with them. The enemy's fighters were no match for the Zero, nor for the superior experience of the Japanese aviators. Those who had tried dogfighting with the Japanese had simply died, as their slower, clumsier aircraft were outturned and then shot down in flames. One Akagi aviator aptly summed up the situation in response to Fuchida's subsequent inquiry. "Enemy fighters are lousy indeed. I think they were almost wiped out." And indeed, most of the American fighters had been slaughtered or driven away in short order. Thereafter, the attack force had continued to the target unhindered. Tomonaga had approached Midway from the north but then circled east. Cardiff II's level bomber formations led off, approaching the island from the northeast at 150 knots at an altitude of 11,000 feet. In this way, Hiryu and Soryu's level bombers would fly down the long axis of each island, including the length of one of the runways on Eastern Island. The force's monolithic formation likely began slipping apart into component Chutai as each formation selected targets and began its attack run. Any belated hopes the Japanese might have had of finding the atoll's defences weak or surprised had vanished in short order, as a storm of flak rose to greet them. The first bursts exploded behind the formation, but the defenders quickly corrected their aim. The Marines' heavy anti-aircraft guns had made the most of the target presented by Tomonaga's stately procession. The Americans had zeroed in and continued firing rapidly. Soon, Tomonaga and his flight found themselves clawing their way through thick, evil clouds of exploding shells. Their aircraft had been buffeted by black shell bursts, and several planes had been hit. One of Hiryu's second Chutai aircraft, that of PO-1C Sakamoto, had been fatally damaged and fell into the lagoon short of Sand Island. To Tomonaga, the flight over the island had seemed interminable. Yet finally they had been able to drop their ordnance, their planes surging upward as the heavy bombs were released. Being able to finally leave the island's defences behind had been the purest joy. Next, it had been the dive bombers' turn. They had loitered to the north, watching the level bomber assault. Now, under Kaga's Buntaicho, Ogawa Shoichi, they had come in from the east. Visibility before the attack had been excellent, but that was before the mayhem that the level bombers had unleashed. The wind was gusting to almost 18 knots, which had the effect of blowing smoke from the first hits west over the islands, obscuring the targets for the following aircraft. The wind also promised to degrade the accuracy of the dive bombers. However, the worst impediment to conducting a smooth attack had again been the island's defences. Against the dive bombers, the Americans had not been restricted to using heavy flak. Numerous automatic weapons had opened up on the Kanbaku. To say that the Japanese were disagreeably surprised by the power of American anti-aircraft fire badly understates the case. The islands had fired back with everything at their disposal, transforming their perimeters into twin rings of fire. Hiryu's report noted that, around the entire circumference of Eastern and Sand Islands, there are many dual-purpose anti-aircraft emplacements of the latest equipment. These guns seem to make use of a director. The accuracy is excellent, and the anti-aircraft fire is intense. Lieutenant Tomonaga himself had never been exposed to American anti-aircraft fire before, though the rumours in the fleet said that during the attack on Pearl Harbor, despite the element of surprise, the Americans had responded with very heavy fire in a matter of minutes. Tomonaga could well believe it. This morning they had certainly staked their claim to having some of the finest flak in the world. The dive bomber attack lasted about 3 minutes, with individual aircraft making their exits on the deck at high speed to avoid return fire. After they left, the fighters continued strafing shore installations and hunting down whatever stray American aircraft they could find. Meanwhile, the attack aircraft had proceeded to the assembly point located west of the island. There they had waited for another 40 minutes before the fighters and stragglers had rejoined them before turning for home at 75. It was difficult for the debriefers back on the 4 carriers to assess the damage inflicted on Midway, as the pilots claimed a wide range of results. Akagi's report stated that the total results of the strike were assessed as small fires being started at 3 places among the land installations. Heavy losses appear to have been inflicted on installations and personnel. It further stated that major fires were started in oil tanks, barracks, and various seaplane sheds. Upping the ante, Kaga's report claimed 9 direct hits with number 25 high-explosive bombs on Sand Island seaplane sheds causing heavy damage and fires, 7 direct hits with number 25 bombs on Sand Island officers and enlisted men's quarters, causing heavy damage and fires. Sand Island oil tank was left on fire. Soryu's report trespassed into the realm of fantasy, recording that her first high-level Chutai had attacked Sand Island dual-purpose batteries. All bombs were hits, silenced 1 emplacement, heavy losses inflicted. Indeed, the tally for her second and third Chutai, which had both attacked the Eastern Island airfield runways, enumerated the same supposedly perfect accuracy. Perhaps merely striking the ground was sufficiently accurate to judge a bomb a hit. However, The scarcely diminished anti-aircraft fire of the Americans must have sounded a cautionary note to these claims. Indeed, Hiryu's report was more restrained than her division mate. The first Chutai scored a hit on a fuel tank in the vicinity of the NE Cape on Sand Island. The tank burned. The second Chutai destroyed part of a dual-purpose gun emplacement on the east shore of Sand Island. The third Chutai covered S-6 flying boat and seaplane ramp at Sand Island and demolished it. In actuality, Tomonaga's assault had done fairly serious damage to the atoll's installations, but had hardly sufficed to put the place out of business. On Eastern Island, bombs had demolished the power plant and the gasoline lines supporting the aircraft servicing areas. This meant that refueling on the airstrip would have to be accomplished by hand. Bombs had hit near the sick bay and had destroyed the command post. The mess hall and post office had been flattened. Another bomb had hit one of the rearming pits near the airstrip, setting off several bombs and killing 4 men. Several bombs had cratered the runway, although the damage to the strip was relatively minor overall. On Sand Island, bombs had hit the waterlines, as well as a trio of oil storage tanks, which were left burning heavily. Various base facilities on the eastern side of the island near the seaplane facilities, the laundry, dispensary, Navy mess hall and galley, brig and contractors' buildings had all been destroyed. The torpedo and bomb site maintenance sheds had both been blown apart. Several of the barracks were badly damaged, and the seaplane hangar had been burned down to a bare steel skeleton. The island had been surmounted by a heavy column of black smoke when Tomonaga's men had left. The various staff officers probably perceived that Tomonaga's initial terse radio report had gotten closer to the nub of the matter than any of the wildly optimistic reports emanating from Soryu's squadron room. The enemy's fighter power had been badly shattered, but his strike planes had already left to attack Kid Butai before the morning raid had hit home. Not only that, but until the American anti-aircraft weapons were destroyed, delivering effective tactical support to the Army and naval landing forces on N-Day would be next to impossible. A second strike was clearly going to be needed to accomplish the goal of neutralizing the target's defenses. All of that, though, would have to wait until the enemy task force was destroyed. Unfortunately, Tomonaga's losses had been heavy, making the job in front of Kid Butai even more difficult. Hiryu's attack unit had suffered the worst of all the carriers. Her fighter group had returned all 9 planes, though 2 of them were deemed unfit for service. Her Kanko squadron, though, had been decimated. Of the 17 planes in the group, after PO-1C Takahashi Toshio's abort, 2 had been shot down outright by fighters, and another by AA over Midway itself. A 4th had disappeared en route home. W.O. Nonaka Satoru's Kanko couldn't quite make it back to the ship, ditching near a cruiser, though he and his crew were recovered. 5 more aircraft had been shot up so badly as to be unserviceable. These included Tomonaga's plane, which had sustained a hit in one of her wing fuel tanks during the initial fracas with the American fighters. Every one of the remaining aircraft had been hit as well, though their damage was minor. In total, this left precisely 8 serviceable aircraft, including Takahashi's, in Hiryu's inventory. Hiryu had also taken on board a straggler from Soryu, piloted by PO-2C Tanabe Masanao. His Kanko had only barely made it back to the fleet and had set down on the closest flight deck he could find, after which it had been written off. Hiryu's division mate Soryu had fared better, though probably more by luck than anything else. Besides Tanabe's battered Kanko, the group had lost 1 plane shot down over Midway, and 2 more had ditched near destroyers after struggling back to the fleet. The ditched crews were both rescued. Of the remaining 14 Kanko that landed on the carrier, 4 were judged out of commission. This left 10 for future operations, although all of these had been damaged to some degree as well. Her 9 fighters, amazingly, had returned completely unscathed. In Cardiff 1, Akagi had lost a fighter shot down by AA over Eastern Island. 3 more Zeros had been damaged to some degree. All of her dive bombers had landed safely, though one was so badly damaged as to be out of commission, and 4 more were damaged to some extent. Kaga's fighter unit had been knocked about as well. One plane had been shot down over Midway, and even despite PO-1C Tanaka gallantly managing to land his plane before he died, his bird was too badly damaged to be usable. Kaga's Kanbaku squadron had lost a single bomber shot down over Sand Island. The total casualties to the Midway strike force was 11 aircraft lost, with another 14 heavily damaged, and 29 more shot up to some degree. Fully half the aircraft involved had been hit. Counting missing aircraft and those rendered out of commission, the mission had lost 23% of its strength in about 30 minutes of combat. 20 aviators were dead or missing, and several more had been wounded. The Kanko crews on board Cardiff 2 must have been stunned. Between the American fighters and the flak, their formations had been decimated. 4 had been shot down, 4 more damaged so badly they had to ditch, and another 9 put out of commission after they made it back. Every other Kanko in Cardiff 2 had been damaged to some extent. In the ready rooms, the talk was grim. If this sort of defensive fire and casualty rate was going to be the norm when flying against the Americans, the carrier attack squadrons would be totally annihilated in the course of a couple more strikes. This did not bode well for coming operations. At 09-117, with the strike aircraft being struck below, Admiral Nagumo altered his course slightly to 070, still at battle speed 22 knots, to close the enemy, which he believed lay directly ahead. The sky had now been clear of enemy aircraft since about 8:40. If that happy state of affairs continued, it would soon be possible to start spotting the counterstrike. It seems almost certain that this is what Nagumo had in mind. It is quite probable that Cardiff 2 began bringing at least some 242 kg high-explosive and 250 kg semi-armor-piercing bombs out of the magazines at this time, so as to have them near to hand when the dive bombers were finally spotted. On Soryu, it would have been possible to bring this ordnance all the way to the flight deck, but there is no evidence that this was done. It is more likely that Hiryu and Soryu both simply brought their ordnance to the hangars in anticipation of spotting. Most accounts of the battle hold that rearming activities were still continuing on Cardiff 1 at this time. Because of this, Fuchida later claimed that the force would not have been ready to launch before 10:30. The Nagumo report anticipated that Cardiff 1 would be ready to go by 10:30, and Cardiff 2 sometime between 10:30 and 1100. Upon closer examination, it is difficult to support the notion that rearming Cardiff 1 would have taken so long. It was now almost an hour and a half since the order had been issued to countermand the 30 to 45 minutes worth of rearming that had occurred before 800. Even despite the occasionally violent manoeuvres the ships had participated in, it is difficult to imagine that rearming had not been fully completed, and that all of Cardiff 1's Type 97 aircraft were now armed with torpedoes. Thus, Nagumo ought to have had sufficient armed and fueled aircraft to attack the enemy with all 4 of his carriers, if he could find the time to spot them. However, no sooner had Kid Butai changed course than a new flight of enemy aircraft was sighted at 098, coming in fine on the port bow. Nagumo's reaction to the new aircraft sightings is not recorded, but it cannot have been a happy one. Fuchida speaks of the mood on the bridge suddenly losing its optimism, but one can't help but imagine a singularly more negative scene unfolding on Akagi's bridge, one of enormous frustration that events were conspiring against them. Both Tone and Chikuma immediately began laying smoke. The fleet increased speed and readied itself for AA action, although the enemy was still some 35 kilometers away. The Capi force, having surged briefly to 36 fighters, was back down to 18 Zeros. Kaga, however, had 2 Shotai warming up on deck under the command of Lieutenant Iizuka Masao, and promptly sent them aloft at 0920. Akagi was in the process of spotting 5 more Zeros, which would go up at 0932, and a further foursome at 0937. This new attack was being delivered by the 15 torpedo bombers of Hornet's VT-8 under Lieutenant CDR John C. Waldron. These were the only aircraft from Hornet that would make it into the fight this morning. As was related previously, rather than flying directly toward the last known position of the Japanese, Hornet's planes had flown west after takeoff, on the decision of their air group leader, Commander Stanhope Ring, commanding VS-8, VB-8, VF-8 and VT-8. However, Waldron, an intense, hard-driving commander, whose men revered him despite the hard work he put them through, was certain that the Japanese lay to the southwest. He had remarked to one of his men before launch to, "Just follow me, I'll take you to 'em." That was precisely what he was doing now. Waldron hadn't been happy with Ring's flight plan from the get-go, and he had not been long in challenging Ring's outbound route. Waldron had broken formation at around 0825, banking left and leading his squadron away independently. The fact that Waldron subsequently closed Kid Butai from almost dead ahead, i.e. from the northeast, is further indication that Ring's flight path was headed due west, and thus missed Nagumo to the north. Whether by his part Cherokee intuition or just a fine appreciation of the enemy, Waldron's instincts were spot on. Waldron seems to have flown a course of 246 degrees, which led almost straight to Nagumo once the latter came to Zo-70. Waldron's flight had traversed the 140-odd miles to Kid Butai, as if connected by a plumb line. However, while Waldron's instincts were to be lauded in leaving Ring's command behind, he discarded any hope of direct fighter support. In so doing, he unknowingly signed his own death warrant and that of every man in his command save one. As Waldron's planes bored in, Kid Butai's carriers began swinging to port, turning westward. This had the effect of putting their sterns to the enemy's line of approach, a manoeuvre they would use time and again when faced with torpedo attacks. When VT-8 began its attack, the carriers were still turning, and their starboard beams were exposed. 3 carriers were directly in front of Waldron, what his squadron report would later characterize as an Akagi-class type on the right and the left, with a Soryu type in the middle. Waldron headed for the center flat top. The Soryu-class carrier in the center was none other than Soryu herself. She was at this very moment bringing on board a shotai of fighters, and was thus relatively vulnerable. However, the Zeros aloft at this moment contained a veritable murderer's row of hot pilots. Akagi's Ono Zenji had just returned to the flagship to replenish his bird, but his 2 wingmen from the 5th watch were still airborne. Joining them was Akagi's 6th watch, a pair of 2 plane shotai led by 2 first-class petty officers, Taniguchi Masao and Iwashiro Yoshio. Taniguchi was destined to become a notable ace, with 14 kills by the end of the war. Kaga now had 9 planes in the air, including her 4th watch under PO-1C Yamamoto Akira. Yamamoto was one of the most senior NCO pilots in the fleet, and would go on to claim 13 enemy aircraft during the conflict. In addition, Kaga's 5th watch had just been launched, a double-fisted pair of shotai under the overall command of Lieutenant Izuka Masao, who was to command several squadrons during the war. Izuka's shotai also contained PO-1C, later WO, Suzuki Kiyonobu, another highly experienced NCO and instructor pilot. A decorated veteran of the China conflict, Suzuki would be credited with 9 planes shot down before his death at the Battle of Santa Cruz later that year. Soryu had her own fighters up as well, a trio of Zeros from the morning strike that had yet to land. Likewise, Hiryu also had Lieutenant Mori Shigeru's shotai aloft. In all, the Japanese sent 21 fighters tearing toward the Americans, with Akagi and Hiryu spotting a further 9 between them to be launched shortly. Not only was Kid Butai's cap relatively sizable to the task, but it also had been alerted in plenty of time. Worse yet for the Americans, their TBD aircraft were underpowered and barely able to break 100 knots while lugging a torpedo. The results reflected these realities. VT-8 was completely annihilated. Initially, Waldron split his force into 2 divisions, one under himself and the other led by his XO, Lieutenant James C. Owens, Jr. However, immediate pressure from the Japanese cap forced the two groups of American planes back together in short order, with Zeros attacking from all sides. By all accounts, Iizuka's Shotai, containing Suzuki, Yamamoto's trio, and Taniguchi's quartet literally tore the American force apart in a series of vicious close-quarter attacks, sending the lumbering bombers blazing down to the ocean below. The Japanese fleet had turned and was running west, so as to place VT-8 at a further disadvantage. As a result, the American run-in lasted perhaps 15 minutes, which was an eternity for the plodding TBDs. 3 of them, however, eventually managed to get close enough to Soryu to oblige her to make a sharp turn to starboard, into the teeth of the American attack. In the midst of this turn, the cap nailed 2 more of the Americans, leaving a single damaged plane aloft. This lone aircraft bored in and made its drop against Soryu's port bow at about 800 yards, then banked to hop over the carrier. Soryu, though, managed to dodge the incoming fish. On the other side of her, the lone Devastator ran headlong into Akagi's newly launched 7th Patrol, led by Leader Shirane Ayao. With the odds 5-on-1, the enemy torpedo plane was quickly shot down almost in the middle of the formation. The pilot, Ensign George H. Gay, was the sole American survivor of the attack. His backseat gunner had been killed by machine gun fire, and he clambered out of his sinking aircraft as it skidded into the water. Promptly hiding under his black rubber seat cushion, Gay managed to avoid being seen by the Japanese ships surrounding him on all sides. One of the most disheartening aspects of VT-8's destruction is that they might have unintentionally had direct fighter support had things gone a little differently. High above and behind them, hovering at 22,000 feet just over the eastern fringe of the Japanese formation, were 10 Wildcat fighters of VF-6 under the command of Lieutenant James Gray. Upon being launched by Enterprise, he had found that her dive bombers had already flown out of sight. He had thereupon mistaken Waldron's low-flying aircraft as his own VT-6. Since Waldron's flight appeared to be alone, Gray had decided to fly top cover for them. Unbeknownst to Waldron, Gray had dutifully followed VT-8 down from the northeast. However, he wasn't flying terribly close escort, and he lost the TBDs below intermediate cloud cover just before Waldron began easing down to make his attack. When Waldron's command disappeared and subsequently did not reappear, Gray had no way of knowing that their attack had been unsuccessful. He had simply never seen them again, nor did he hear their calls for help. Not only that, but Gray and his command were subsequently to miss their own VT-6's call for assistance some 20 minutes later. The date of 4th of June will forever remain as something less than a shining monument to American radio reception. Like Waldron, Gray had sighted Japanese vessels at 1 o'clock at about 09:10, and he had checked his forward progress. So far as he knew, Enterprise's dive bombers ought to be close at hand, and thus Gray had loitered on the edge of a battle he wasn't even aware of, in order to be available to support his dive bombers when the moment came. From where he circled, Gray was able to catch glimpses of Kid Butai through the clouds. However, apparently at no time during the next 45 minutes did he ever see more than 2 Japanese carriers, a clear indication that Cardiff 2 was operating at a goodly distance from Cardiff 1 during much of that time. In fact, the evidence suggests that by about this time, Cardiff 2 and Cardiff 1 had effected a de facto, if not an intentional, separation from one another. This makes a good deal of sense, in that the operational speed of Cardiff 2 was a good 5 to 7 knots faster than Cardiff 1. If anyone was going to open up a gap, it would have been the speedier ships at the front of the formation. The Imperial Navy didn't mind having fairly loose spacing between their carrier divisions, and Zuikaku's experience at Coral Sea, wherein she had been spared attack by fortuitously not being too close to Shokaku, had been noted by the Japanese. Indeed, beyond mere reasons of defensive expediency, it is possible that a desire for operational separation may have entered into the last-minute adjustments of Kid Butai's formation this morning. For his part, Gray continued loitering high above Kid Butai's eastern flank, making leisurely turns to conserve fuel, and waiting for Enterprise's dive bombers to join him. He found it remarkable that there were no Zeros coming after him. To Gray, it seemed that there must have been a breakdown in the Japanese cap. The truth was that at 0910, the cap was all at low level, and shortly would be pouncing on Waldron. However, the Japanese failure to discover and attempt to intercept Gray's command until much later does speak of the Japanese weakness at detecting and combating high-level threats, particularly in conditions of scattered cloud cover. No one knew it at the time, but the truth was that Kid Butai had just reached a crucial point of no return. If the Japanese were to launch aircraft against the Americans before their rendezvous with fate now only an hour hence, they would have needed to start spotting them in the teeth of Waldron's attack. Yet Nagumo still had no clear idea of exactly where the American carriers were, since Tone No. 4's spotting information was apparently not considered trustworthy. Not only that, but Soryu's Type 2 bomber had not radioed in any new information either. This was, in fact, VT-8's true contribution to the battle, and the meaning of its sacrifice, not, as commonly asserted, that it had drawn the cap Zeros down to sea level. Rather, Waldron's head-on attack caused Nagumo to reverse course out of the wind. It also delayed his spotting by tying down the Japanese flight decks with yet more cap operations. Crew Div 8's laying smoke in reaction to Waldron's appearance, as well as the force's anti-aircraft fire thereafter, may also have attracted the unwanted attentions of yet another American torpedo squadron that was shortly to make its appearance. It is probable that at this point, or perhaps even sooner, the Kanbaku on Cardiff 2 had begun to be armed while still in the hangars. Realizing that the flight decks were in constant operation, the armourers were going ahead and attaching bombs to their charges. If nothing else, it would shave 5 or 10 minutes off the spotting process whenever that was ordered. But as long as the Americans kept attacking and new cap fighters were needed, no one knew when that might be. Far to the southwest of Kid Butai, destroyer Arashi was still prowling fretfully in search of the elusive Nautilus. Starting at 0918, Lieutenant William Brockman had dived to 200 feet, trying to shake the Japanese destroyer, but Arashi remained on the scent. At 0933, she made a final depth charge attack. At that point, Commander Watanabe decided that even if he had not nailed the Yankee submarine, he had held it down long enough for the carriers to have made it safely through the danger zone. He thereafter set course north-northeast to rejoin Kid Butai. Ironically, according to Brockman, Arashi's final pair of depth charges were the closest to the mark of any dropped thus far. But as the sweating Americans listened below, the attacks died down, and Arashi's screws drew away. By 0955, even her echo ranging had ceased. Nautilus began heading back up to periscope depth. Meanwhile, Petty Officer Amari and Tone No. 4 were still on the air. In fact, Amari was begging to break off his mission, reporting at 0930 that his fuel was running low and that he needed to return. He was told by Admiral Abe at 0935 to wait until 1000 to do so. Amari, probably nearly frantic by this time, replied at 0938 with a terse, "I can't do it." In the meantime, Chikuma was launching its No. 5 aircraft, a Type 0 floatplane commanded by PO-1C Takezaki Masatake, to contact the American fleet. Depending on the ship concerned, the Japanese logged Waldron's gallant attack as petering out between 0930 to 0935. By that time, all of the American aircraft were in the drink. Kid Butai was still on a course westward for the moment. Though the carriers remained in a roughly box-like formation, their positions had shifted, with Kaga now leading Akagi in the southern column. Before the Japanese could consider shifting course back to the northeast, even as Arashi was dropping her last charges and Chikuma was sending up her No. 5 plane, another attack developed. At 0938, the Japanese sighted a low line of devastators coming in from the south. This was VT-8's sister squadron, VT-6, from the Enterprise, commanded by Lieutenant CDR Eugene Gene E. Lindsay. Again, their low-altitude approach meant that they were sighted while still a good distance from the fleet. Akagi's log avers that she saw the attackers 50 kilometers out. With Kid Butai still heading west, the Americans were attacking from the port beam. From behind the windscreens of VT-6, the Japanese fleet was in a very loose formation and appeared to have 3 carriers in the center. The outer screen was on a 15-mile circle and was composed of light cruisers, SIC. The inner screen was on an 8-mile circle and was composed of heavy cruisers and a few battleships. Destroyers accompanied each carrier and were present at other points in the screen. The carriers and accompanying destroyers maneuvered independently at high speed, while the screening ships maintained their relative positions and were not making such high speeds. This remarkably accurate description corresponds very closely with the facts. The 4 carriers were indeed in a box formation, albeit one that shifted at times into a ragged diamond. The 2 outer circles of screening vessels tended to turn in formation and tried to maintain their relative positions. Immediately upon sighting Kid Butai, Lindsay split his squadron into 2 divisions of 7 planes apiece, hoping to gain a position to deliver a hammer and anvil attack against one of the carriers. His target was Kaga. This was because VT-8's attack 20 minutes prior had disrupted any semblance of order in Kid Butai's formation. Whatever evasive pirouettes Akagi had performed during Waldron's assault, and the indications are that they were both extensive and swift, had not been matched by her dowdier 28-knot cousin. This, in combination with the fleet's reverse turn, meant that Kaga was now the southwesternmost carrier in the formation, and hence the one most likely to be singled out for VT-6's unwanted attentions. At 0938, Kid Butai predictably commenced wide turns to starboard and course 300 degrees, so as to put the American planes directly astern. Once again, the TBDs had to first overhaul their prey and then come around the bow for an attack. Kaga's turn away also had the effect of leaving Lindsay's division hanging out in left field. The American commander therefore led his men around to the north, while Lieutenant Arthur Ely, his exec, took his division more directly toward Okada's towering flight deck. The one thing VT-6 had going for it, at least initially, was that there were no Zeros to be seen. In truth, Kaga was in something of a pickle. The cap was up to 30 fighters, but most of the Zeros had been pulled off to the northeast to deal with Waldron's attack. As a result, this new assault from another quarter found Kaga's own fighters out of position, and with few others nearby. Kaga's turn away thus served a twofold need. It bought time for Kaga to complete warming up another set of 6 fighters, and it gave Captain Okada the chance to put out the word that a little assistance was in order. Thus, for a time, the Americans came in relatively unopposed. In fact, both American divisions made it past the outlying Japanese destroyers and were headed in toward Kaga before the Japanese cap began to reassert its presence. Ely's division, being closest to the bulk of the Japanese fighters racing in from the east and northeast, not surprisingly came under fire first. Once again, the same general progression of destruction played itself out, with the Zeros slicing the American formation apart and spraying the devastators with well-aimed bursts of fire. The Americans, unable to do much more than huddle up into smaller and smaller groups, fired back with their twin-free machine guns. But the end result for Ely's division, though it took somewhat longer to unfold, could not help but be grimly similar to that of VT-8. Overhauling Kaga, pokey as she was, proved almost impossible as soon as the Zeros finally made their appearance. Ely's formation came apart under the increasingly heavy deluge of fire. One by one, the devastators lost their battles and went flaming into the drink. However, Okada also did his best to maximize Kaga's own chances, staging a veritable seminar on how to handle a carrier against torpedo aircraft. Realizing that he was being pinned between 2 divisions, Okada continued boring away to the northwest as long as possible. Finally, 2 aircraft of Ely's division reached their drop points and released. Okada saw at once that the American drop angles were lousy. Kaga dodged them with ease, turning away to port and reversing course. This had the effect of bringing Kaga into the teeth of Lindsay's group, But Okada reversed course yet again and continued heading to the north-northwest, with the Americans now back on his port quarter. For his part, Lindsay had thus far enjoyed remarkably good success. While Ely's men were being shot to pieces, the Japanese Kapi hadn't been able to get a grip on him. True, there were Zeros around and they were shooting, but they seemed to be out of cannon ammunition. Consequently, his group had yet to take any casualties, and he had managed to attain a position on Kaga's port beam that held out some hope of making a good attack. If they had been equipped with the newer, faster TBFs, they might have made it. But it was at this precise moment that everything fell apart. Akagi had launched a fresh shottai of fighters under Lieutenant Ibusuke Masanobu, his second flight of the morning, at Aero 9:45. Kaga, for her part, finally hurled aloft 6 of her own Zeros at 1,000 into the very teeth of Lindsay's final attack run. These Kaga fighters collectively were a somewhat ragtag group of ensigns and non-coms, but this group contained several seasoned veterans. It was these 9 fresh Zeros that set upon Lindsay in the last minutes before he was able to gain a favourable attack position. Lindsay, by this time, was desperately calling for support from his own fighters, but was receiving no answer from Lieutenant Gray's Wildcats. They were still loitering high overhead, some 20 miles to the northeast. As with VT-8, because of the scattered cloud cover in the area and their high altitude, Gray had not observed VT-6's attack materializing on the opposite side of the enemy formation. Nor did he or his men hear Lindsay's radio calls for help. Thus, 2 opportunities for direct fighter support of the American torpedo aircraft had been lost. Indeed, by about Aero 9:50, the fuel tanks in Gray's Wildcats had pushed well past half empty. If he didn't leave soon, he and his command weren't going to make it back. Reluctantly, he turned for home, but not before sending a sighting report back to Enterprise at Aero 952, followed by an elaboration at 1,000. This report, which explicitly mentioned the presence of only 2 Japanese carriers, was the first concrete sighting information that Task Force 16 had received since it had overheard Howard Adey and William Chase's PBY spotting reports during the morning. It was only as Gray departed that the Japanese belatedly noticed the American fighters that had been circling ahead of their force for the better part of an hour. SRI quickly launched a shottai of Zeros under PO-1C Harada Kaname to go after Gray's group, which was thought to be a horizontal bombing unit. By the time Harada and his men began to climb, though, Gray had departed the area. Meanwhile, Lindsay's entire division was in terrible trouble. The commander was apparently the first to be shot down as this last-second opposition materialized almost out of nowhere. Lindsay's men kept shooting back and managed to send C-1C Sano Shinpei's Akagi Zero down, but 4 of the Americans were splashed in short order, and much as they tried, the remaining 3 found it impossible to attain a favourable drop angle. Finally, in desperation, the Americans let fly with their torpedoes at extreme range at about 1,000. It was a valiant attempt, but Okada immediately treated them to an evasive turn back to the south, spoiling the chances of their fish. The cap thereupon sent the American survivors packing. Unfortunately for Lindsay's remaining men, they were now deep inside the Japanese formation, making getting out almost as problematic as getting in had been. Indeed, several VT-6 aircraft were still being attacked as late as 10:10 as they were clearing the area to the east and southeast. Fortunately for the Americans, the wide spacing between the screening ships created large gaps to fly through. By the time it was all over, though, only 5 aircraft from VT-6's 2 divisions, 3 from Lindsay's, 2 from Ely's, remained aloft, all damaged to some degree, and one of these would not make it back home. Neither Ely nor the dogged Lindsay was among the survivors. Despite VT-6's gallant determination, both US and Japanese analysts ironically later found fault with the attack. In his own comments on the squadron's after-action report, RADM Thomas C. Kincaid concluded that it is essential that the attack be pressed home without delay when the objective has been sighted. For his part, Gender was inclined to agree with Kincaid's basic assessment. He had watched VT-6 laboriously close on Kaga, with the American planes being shot down one by one. His professional interest piqued. Gender remarked that some of the Americans had apparently hesitated to make a daring dash toward us in the face of attacks from both the air and sea. In this respect, both Kincaid and Gender were being critical of what they did not fully understand. When carrying a 1-ton torpedo, dashing did not well describe the Devastator's handling characteristics. Given the wretched stern chase it had been forced to make, by all rights VT-6 should have been annihilated in exactly the same manner as VT-8. But three factors had spared the lives of at least some of its aviators. First, the attack had developed along an axis the Japanese cap was initially ill-prepared to defend. As a result, fighter opposition was spotty at first, especially for Lindsay's division. The Americans had made it well into the heart of the Japanese formation before things began coming unglued. Second, it was clear that the ability of the Zero to kill American aircraft was proportional to the amount of 20mm cannon ammunition available. American carrier planes, even obsolete ones like the TBD, were quite sturdy. A good hit from an explosive cannon shell could potentially take one down, but it was much more difficult to do the same with just 7.7mm machine gun fire. The Americans were lucky, in that having hunted Waldron's men to destruction just 20 minutes earlier, many of the Japanese fighters had shot their bolt and were low on 20mm ammo. This undoubtedly spelled salvation for some of VT-6's aircraft. Third, we know that at least some of the American aircraft were spared by Japanese fighters once they had dropped their torpedoes. This hardly reflected an altruistic spirit on the part of Kid Butai's aviators. Like fighter pilots on both sides of this bitter Pacific struggle, they bore no great love for their counterparts, and had already demonstrated this day that they would gladly machine gun American flyers, even in their parachutes, if the opportunity afforded itself. Yet a TBD that had released its torpedo was no longer an immediate danger to the fleet, and some of the Japanese pilots at least were apparently being driven to conserve their ammunition for more worthy targets. This last point is important, in that it gives a better sense for what the mood in the fleet probably was at around 1000. It would be tempting at this point in the proceedings to portray the Japanese attitude toward their enemies as being one of contempt. After all, aside from the B-17s, they had crushed every American attack thrown their way. Complacency would certainly appear to have been the prevalent attitude in the upper command ranks. While there may have been vexation at the delays imposed in launching the counterstrike, there is no sense from the accounts of the senior officers that there was any real fear about the ultimate outcome of the fight. Gender noted that his initial concerns over the force's ability to defend itself against American air attacks had now been swept away by the successful repulsion of Waldron's and Lindsay's attacks. The picture one gets is that everyone on Nagumo's staff felt that they could absorb whatever attacks the Americans could mete out. True, there may have been irritation and even concern at the delay, but a sense of real urgency about the matter seems to have been lacking. If this was truly their attitude, then it was founded on a lack of understanding of the capabilities of their opponents, as well as a failure to comprehend the frailties of an already overstretched air defense system. The fact that at this juncture in the battle some of the Japanese cap pilots would deliberately let American aircraft escape once they had dropped their weapons reveals a much different picture. There had to have been some sense among Kid Butai's fighter pilots that things were balanced on a bit of a knife's edge. The American attacks were incessant and were now beginning to arrive from different directions. The cap had little in the way of long-range detection or guidance from their ships, so they couldn't simply guard a single threat vector along which the attacks would develop. Instead, the Zero pilots had to remain vigilant to the possibility of danger developing from almost any quarter. The cap was therefore dispersed roaming around in small elements near their home vessels, trying to stay alert to the visual cues of the pickets, and then pouncing on targets that came into their sector. Further, the cap had demonstrated that it had a tendency to bunch up. In several instances, the entire cap had responded to an incoming attack, leaving nothing in reserve over other sectors of the fleet. The cap behaved almost organically like white blood cells swarming a toxin. Once the enemy was engaged by a single shot eye, it tended to pull adjacent shot eye into the fray almost magnetically. But there was little calculation in the cap's response. If multiple attacks developed in rapid succession, the cap's ability to snap back and react quickly to new threats was limited. This was all symptomatic of the Japanese lack of adequate fighter direction. If the launch activities of the morning are any indication, the ship's captains and Hikocho were keenly aware of these deficiencies. Captain Okada and his counterparts knew that the only way to react quickly was to keep a sharp lookout and a brace of fresh fighters on deck that could be launched as new threats developed. Ammunition depletion only accentuated this risk of overstretching. Taken together, this couldn't have been a comfortable position to be in, especially immediately after repulsing an assault. The result was that the Japanese pilots, and their appreciation of the dangers Kid Butai was facing, were likely more in tune with the reality of the situation than anyone in Nagumo's staff. Furthermore, it should have been of concern to both Nagumo and his staff that the fleet was being shoved around by these attacks. The attack by VT-8 had been equivalent to a stone thrown into a group of pigeons, blowing apart Kid Butai's formation and forcing it west. The attack by VT-6 had been a longer, more grinding affair. Nagumo and his carriers had had little choice but to run northwest for a full 20 minutes. Thus, a perceptive observer would have noticed that Japanese control over the flow of events was almost non-existent. They were trying to recapture the initiative, but in truth they were still in reaction mode. This was no way to win a battle. Nevertheless, at 1000, with his ships now turning onto their new heading of 030, Nagumo sent an upbeat report of the battle to Yamamoto, Kondo, submarine commander Komatsu, and Tanaka's invasion force. Carried out air attack of AF at 0630. Many enemy shore-based planes attacked us subsequent to 0715. We have suffered no damages. At 0728, enemy composed of 1 carrier, 7 cruisers and 5 destroyers sighted in, grid position to Shai Rai 34, on course southwest, speed 20 knots. After destroying this force, we plan to resume our AF attack. Our position at 1000 is, grid, Chi EA00, course 30 degrees, speed 24 knots. This message captures both Nagumo's spirit and his intentions less than 20 minutes before total disaster overtook him. Kid Butai was closing with the enemy. In the hangars of all 4 carriers, the arming process was surely complete, and they were waiting only for the go-ahead to start spotting the flight decks. 45 minutes after that, launch would be possible. It was true that the tempo of cap operations had forestalled this action longer than Nagumo had wished. Still, in Nagumo's mind, the picture seemed to be improving now that Kaga had shaken off the last of her attackers. Unbeknownst to Admiral Nagumo, just as VT-6 was in the final minutes of its ordeal, Kid Butai had been sighted by 2 new and entirely separate American aircraft formations. The first was Enterprise's entire dive bomber group, under CV-6's Air Group Commander, Lieutenant Dr. Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr. He was currently leading 2 squadrons, Scouting 6, under Lieutenant Wilmer Earl Gallagher, and Bombing 6, under Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best. McCluskey's group was approaching Kid Butai from the southwest at an altitude of 19,000 feet. This had come about in a completely unanticipated fashion. McCluskey had set out from Enterprise at 0752, on course 231 degrees, expecting Nagumo to have continued on toward Midway. As such, he ought to have intercepted the Japanese about 142 miles out. Because of the delays in Enterprise's flight operations, however, his 33 SBDs were on their own, with no fighter escort once Lieutenant Gray followed after Waldron's VT-8. Contact was swiftly lost, with VT-6's 14 TBDs following behind, as Lindsay apparently split the distance between McCluskey's flight and Waldron's, opting for a course of about 240 degrees, which turned out to be a more or less direct line to the enemy. As it developed, Nagumo's movement east at 0832 had the effect of leaving Enterprise's dive bombers too far south on their outbound route. This was further complicated by Kid Butai's turn to east-northeast at 0917, although VT-8's attack soon shoved the fleet back westward. McCluskey had hoped to sight the Japanese at about 0920, but by then Kid Butai was, in fact, nearly due west of his group at approximately his 2 o'clock position, and was currently running west itself. Cruising along at 20,000 feet, the cloud cover never allowed the Americans so much as a peep of the Japanese. By 0930, McCluskey knew he was directly over where Nagumo's projected course track ought to have taken his fleet. He saw nothing. Therefore, per his plan, at 0935 he turned to 315 degrees to fly up the approach course of the enemy. He intended to follow this reciprocal route for some 50 miles, until 1000. At that point, he would alter course northeast, fly a short distance, and then reluctantly head for home. Fuel was already getting low, and he didn't have all day. McCluskey was banking that this rather basic search pattern would bring him at least a glimpse of the Japanese fleet. He eventually caught the glimpse he was hoping for, but it so happened that it was of only a tiny portion of Nagumo's fleet. At 0955, McCluskey spied the wake of a lone ship northeast of him and headed over the horizon in the same direction. It was kicking up a very pronounced bow wave and moving fast. He identified it as a cruiser. In fact, it was a Rashi, which had been keeping Nautilus's head down. Having broken off her attack 15 minutes earlier, she was scrambling to return to the task force. Reasoning that this ship would lead him to the Japanese carriers, McCluskey made to overhaul her from the southwest. At 1000 he was rewarded with the sight of many wakes dead ahead through the scattered clouds, some 35 miles ahead. At 1002 he radioed Raymond Spruance the electrifying news, "This is McCluskey, have sighted the enemy." Meanwhile, to the east of McCluskey, a group of aircraft from Yorktown was also entering the battlefield. This formation consisted of VT-3 under Lieutenant C. Dr. Lance E. Lem Massey, VB-3 led by Lieutenant C. Dr. Maxwell F. Leslie, and VF-3 under Lieutenant C. Dr. John Smith Jimmy Thatch. It will be recalled that the other American carrier aircraft formations had travelled outward in small groups and then been separated. Not so those of Yorktown, the most experienced of the American carriers. Because of careful planning, her group had remained closely coordinated, with each of the tactical elements remaining in sight of each other up until the time they initiated their attack. All three groups had been droning along on 240 degrees. At 1003, one of VT-3's crewmen spied smoke off to the northwest. VT-3, VB-3, and Thatch's 6 accompanying fighters all turned right to approach the enemy. Thus, for the first time in the battle, an American carrier air group had the very real possibility of delivering a coordinated high-low assault against the enemy. The effect of these totally unrelated sightings was to place Kid Butai in grave danger. By dint of a healthy dollop of bad luck, the Japanese were now effectively placed between an enormous hammer and anvil. Previously, lone American squadrons attacking without support or the benefit of combined arms had divided into two elements so as to try and catch single Japanese carriers between their attacking groups. This time, the Americans were bringing 4 attack squadrons to the Fight 3 dive bomber units and a torpedo squadron. More important, the American air groups were approaching along 2 separate axes, and yet were fortuitously arriving over the target at roughly the same time. 3 of the American squadrons were coming in at high altitude, another fairly low, and there were even some fighters thrown in for good measure. This was far and away the most challenging threat the Japanese had faced all morning, and it was against this attack that Japanese air defences would finally and catastrophically fail. It's worth taking a moment to comment on the shape of the Japanese carrier formation at about 1000. With Kaga out of immediate danger, Nagumo ordered Kid Butai to resume a northeast course of 030. Once again, the 4 carriers turned in their tracks to comply with their new orders. Out on the eastern edge of the carrier group, Cardiff II had effectively been isolated from VT6's attack. Hiryu and Soryu had loped northwest, roughly abreast, paralleling Cardiff I's movements as the American attack had developed. Now, with another turn to the northeast, Cardiff II was placed in the van of the carrier group once more. Soryu, as the easternmost carrier during the run northwest, was now in the front of the carrier formation, with Hiryu trailing her. Behind, the two carriers of Cardiff I brought up the rear, with Akagi off of Kaga's starboard bow, but on roughly the same east-west line. All semblance of a box formation had by now disappeared. Instead, Nagumo's carriers were strung out in a rough line ahead to the northeast. The distance between the two carrier divisions was almost certainly greater than 7,000 meters, and that between the lead ship, Soryu, and Kaga, the most westerly, was probably more than 15,000 meters. Eyewitness accounts on board Soryu at this time mention Cardiff I as being little more than vague, blocky smudges on the horizon. Likewise, a diagram drawn by a Soryu survivor shows Soryu at the apex of a triangle, with Kaga on its left bottom corner and Akagi on its right bottom, which broadly fits the same picture. This positioning of Soryu at the fore of the formation at 1000 stands in contrast with every preceding history of the battle, which universally have Hiryu in the lead. Indeed, it has always been supposed that the only reason Hiryu escaped the coming attack was because she was far enough in front of the rest of the carriers that she avoided the attention of Yorktown's dive bombers, which presumably came in from the southeast. However, a careful reading of the Nagumo report and other evidence from both the American and Japanese side leads to a much different picture. These matters are intriguing and important, for the exact shape and heading of Nagumo's carriers in this time frame has been the source of considerable disagreement down through the years. For the moment, we ask the reader to simply hold these thoughts, as the subsequent 10 minutes and the developing attacks of the Americans will shed additional light on why this configuration for Kid Butai makes better sense than previous renditions. VT6's survivors were still desperately struggling to escape the battlefield as VT3's attack began materializing. At 1006, flagship Akagi spotted torpedo bombers some 45 km distant at a heading of 118 degrees true off the starboard beam. Whether her lookouts also glimpsed the American fighters and dive bombers that were almost directly over VT3 at this same time is open to speculation, but it is likely they did not. Captain Aoki apparently judged VT3's threat to be distant enough that he could afford to make a brief digression to the east to land some fighters. Akagi turned to course 092 at 10:10 and brought down 3 Zeros from her 5th and 6th watches. However, as the American torpedo planes continued boring in, Akagi turned her stern to them and headed northwest. As soon as the fighters were stowed, Aoki ordered another shot-eye of Zeros spotted on deck and warmed up. If this new American attack was of similar magnitude to the ones just before, Akagi might need to defend herself shortly. On Akagi's air control platform, Hikocho Masuda was having, in his own words, one hell of a long day. It has been commonly supposed that VT3's attack preceded that of the Yorktown dive bombers by a good bit. However, more recent scholarship on the American side of the battle has confirmed that VT3's assault lasted longer than previously thought and culminated after the dive bomber attack. Like all the American torpedo attacks this morning, the fact that the TBDs were so slow meant that the attack took a while to develop. Not only that, but VT3 would subsequently switch targets during its run-in, lengthening the overall engagement. Indeed, some of the American dive bomber pilots stated that after bombing Kaga and Akagi, they witnessed aircraft from VT3 still heading northward to attack their target. For their part, the Japanese also saw the torpedo aircraft as part of a nearly simultaneous, continuous attack. The Japanese cap at 10:10 consisted of 36 fighters, though shortly it would be up to 42. Many of these aircraft were undoubtedly still clustered near Kaga or engaged southeast of the fleet chasing VT6's remnants, and as mentioned previously, Soryu's 5th Patrol, under PO-1C Harada, was heading east and climbing to chase after Gray's recently departed Wildcats. Shortly, however, Harada would bring his men about to confront the new threat developing to the southeast. Thus, the bulk of Kid Butai's fighters were likely distributed in a belt stretching roughly northwest to southeast across the force.